I've seen and heard horrors in my 20 years as a nurse, but nothing compares to today's patient, a little girl with Tourette's. At this hospital, NHS staff suffer abuse every day. I'm no stranger to repugnant words, or even physical assaults. I'm no stranger to Tourette's either. There are very few mental or physical conditions I haven't seen over the course of 2 decades. Earlier this morning, in fact, I would have quite confidently told you I'd met every mold and manner of human. I hadn't. Tourette syndrome is a misunderstood condition. It's a tic disorder, and tics are, in most cases, small muscle convulsions. Only about 1 in 10 sufferers deal with coprolalia, the involuntary vocalization of obscenities deemed socially inappropriate. What most people misunderstand is that sufferers do not choose the words they utter. Their brains spit out the most taboo word or phrase in any given situation, which causes them immense distress. Because such vulgarity or cruelty evidently doesn't align with their personality or beliefs. I say evidently, but the nature of the condition wasn't evident to my colleagues when we were entrusted with the post-surgery care of Jessica, an 8-year-old girl with a severe tongue laceration. She was rushed into the hospital by her flustered and red-eyed mother, Liz, a suspicious woman who spent most of the morning looking over her shoulder. "That girl is an absolute monster," said a nurse called Linda. "She just called me a slur." I was empathetic. "I'm sorry. That's horrible. Tourette's is a nasty thing. But I promise you, the girl didn't mean to say that to you, Linda. Do you want a... Yeah, no shit. But it doesn't excuse her racism. Tourette's is like alcohol. It lowers the inhibitions and tells you what a person really thinks. Reveals those dark, inside thoughts we want to keep hidden. Lord help me. This person is supposed to be a medical professional," was my immediate thought. But I took a polite tact aloud. "Jessica is not a covert racist, Linda, because there was no intent behind the words she used. Her brain convulsed and vomited out the things she didn't want to say. She called Brian a homophobic slur earlier. I don't care," interrupted Linda. "I'll find someone else to do this shift with you, because I don't want to be around that vile creature. I'd muzzle her if it were up to me." I was honestly glad my colleague left, given that final admission. I was devastated for the little girl, who kept apologizing with teary eyes and a quivering lip after everything expletive or vile word she uttered to hospital staff. Jessica's tongue had been severed widthways to a halfway point, requiring sutures to knot it back together. She was playing with scissors, and I managed to save her just in time. "I brought her straight here," Liz had explained to doctors. Now, given Jessica's injury, I understand her mother's flustered demeanor, but there was something off about the story, or the way Liz told it. It's my duty to report suspicious circumstances. So I told the mother to wait outside whilst I spoke to Jessica, who watched me with doe eyes and quavering lips. "Is Mummy telling the truth?" I asked her. Her rogue tongue answered, "Fat bitch." I smiled softly to let her know it was okay. The words hurt, of course, but they had no meaning. It was Jessica's pain that hurt me more greatly. She was nearly weeping. "Sorry. No need for that. Do you often say sorry to people for the things Tourette's makes you say?" The girl nodded. Then I asked the question I really wanted to ask. "At home?" No response that time. But I pressed. "Is that how you really got hurt today, Jessica? Did Mummy get upset with you?" "No," she said, before clasping her mouth to muffle her troublesomely telltale tongue. Jessica had the beginnings of a bobblehead, juddering about as I took her along a bumpy road of question. After question, after question, I had to do it. She was clearly wrestling with a secret. I suddenly heard squabbling past the entrance to the ward, and I clocked Liz arguing with a man in the corridor. Then he threw the door to the wall and marched inside. "Who are you?" I asked. The man stabbed a finger at Jessica, who seemed to clench a little in response. "Her father. Come on, Jessica. We're going home." The sad little girl in the blue hospital gown got to her feet without so much as a moment's hesitation, and her meek mother met her at the end of the bed to take her hand. I heard shuffles from nearby beds, shielded by curtains, as curious patients were clearly eavesdropping on the commotion. "Let's just have a chat first," I implored as Jessica was led away from me. "We need to at least do a discharge assessment to discuss a care plan for the coming weeks." The father smiled at me, but it was a faux smile, like the apology that followed. "I'm so sorry for the inconvenience, ma'am. I'm sure she's been shouting the whole hospital down, hasn't she?" "She's been fine," I said firmly. "Of course she has," he sighed. "I think she'll be happier once she's back home. Away from all these people, you know? It's not nice for them to hear her." I scowled. "It's not nice for her to have to deal with the condition." The father narrowed his eyes, seemingly cross with me for daring challenge him. "Right. Well, I think we'll take it from here. Thanks for your help. Time to get the girl back to her proper room." "Trapped! Trapped!" screamed Jessica as she pulled away from her mother's hand, limbs convulsing. The girl looked at me in abject terror, and I realized that had been not a cry for help, but a tic. Jessica hadn't wanted to say a thing. This time, she had not involuntarily said something offensive, but something dangerous. Something, in her eyes, that was the worst possible thing to say in that given moment. All this was confirmed by the cold way her father looked at her. Tourette's was his explanation to me, through gritted teeth, as he walked to his wife and daughter. "Come along, you two." As I watched the parents take their little girl away, I was similarly possessed by dangerous words that jumped from my mouth, of their own volition. I knew it was dangerous, but I had to ask. "Who tried to cut off your tongue, Jessica?" It wasn't a tic this time. The girl was brave enough to answer. "Daddy." The man's eyes narrowed at her, then at me. I whimpered fearfully at not only that, but at Jessica being dragged out of the ward by her mother. She knew what would come next. Of course she did. Liz had come into a stiflingly hot hospital ward with a turtleneck jumper up to the chin, forever adjusting the sleeves, seemingly afraid that too much of her skin might show. She was hiding something, just as her daughter had been, until Tourette's snatched the reins. I was midway through processing all of that, as Jessica's father thrust me against the wall, elbow against my windpipe to stifle the scream trying to get out of my open mouth. With his spare hand, he slipped fingers into that open mouth, then took hold of my tongue, as if it were a weed to be rooted out. "I could get rid of this," he said matter-of-factly. "And your hands, and your eyes, you'd be alive, but you wouldn't be able to find a way to tell a soul what you just heard. Please." I tried to choke out. He shook his head. "Here's what will happen now. I will take my daughter away from here, and nobody will ever see her again. Nobody will ever hear her dirty tongue again. She might as well not exist, as far as you're concerned. Remember that, or you might stop existing too. Okay? Help!" yelled out another patient behind a closed curtain. "Somebody get in here!" He may well have saved my life, because Jessica's father unhanded me at that moment and ran after his wife and daughter, scooting them out of the room. Hospital staff rushed into the ward moments too late. The security officers searched for Jessica and her parents, but they were gone. I talked to the police earlier. They sent someone around to the family's home, but there were no cars in the driveway, and nobody in the house. They'd fled. What terrifies me is that my shift ends in a few hours. An officer assured me that I'd be safe, but they're hardly going to appoint a round-the-clock detail to me. Are they? Nurses receive violent threats every day. There's nothing special about this in their eyes, and there's no concrete evidence, so I was told, to incriminate Jessica's father just yet. I would argue there's a wealth of evidence that something terrible is happening. That man wanted to silence his daughter by taking out her tongue. He was no doubt interrupted by his wife halfway through the assault. She managed to get her daughter away and to a non-local hospital. But he found them. He took them away. I fear, this time, he will finish the job.
"10% of people aren't people at all. I'm an entomologist, which means I concern myself with the study of insects. Discussing my line of work tends to bore people to tears, but children are absolutely enthralled by what I do, which is why I started providing educational talks for schools visiting the local Natural History Museum. I loved inspiriting youngsters about the most fascinating biological class of the animal kingdom. Fascination and terror are not mutually exclusive, as I learned 6 months ago. And I'm starting to wish my disinterested friends and family were correct. It would be better for all of us if there truly were nothing extraordinary about insects. Following one of my museum talks in late summer, a schoolboy waited until his teacher was distracted by his classmates. Then he peeled away from the class to timorously tell me about his discovery of a new insect, one with wings colored a weird white, and making a whispery buzzing noise that you only hear if you pay close attention. He wasn't the first excitable child, or even adult, to mistakenly proclaim himself the discoverer of a new species, but he was certainly the first frightened one. His fear piqued my curiosity. So when he told me to go underneath the pier at the local beach and see the white-winged insect for myself, I did just that. I was a good 100 yards away when I first clocked the white-winged bugs. They were emitting a nauseatingly intimate buzz, like paper crinkling in my ear canals, as if they were nearer to me than they seemed to be. I told myself they must be glasshouse whiteflies, but such sap-feeding bugs would have been entirely out of place beneath a ramshackle wooden pier. Besides, the truth of the matter was that they didn't look like whiteflies. They were about 4 times too large, and their shade of white was like no shade of white I'd seen before. Weird white, the boy had called it. Still, I dismissed that as a thought born of my sleep-deprived mind, much as I dismissed the alien crinkling sound, like no insect I'd ever heard. A whispery buzzing noise that you only hear if you pay close attention. The boy had been right again. I'd walked the pier dozens of times and probably never heard the little bugs, despite walking right overhead. It was only now, as I was looking and listening for them, that I had clocked them. Even if I were to dismiss those many oddities, there was no dismissing their method of retreat. The bugs dove into the sea. I must have paled. I'd never seen anything like it. Suicidal insects, I hypothesized, but I went over to the water lapping the shoreline and saw not a single drowned bug floating atop the surface. The flying bugs had swum underwater and vanished. My colleagues laughed about my flying aquatic insect, and I found myself laughing with them. Disturbingly, the memory was already muddying in my mind. It was a type of lethargy like none I'd ever experienced before. I honestly believe, had that little boy not revisited the museum with his parents a week later, my brain would have erased all knowledge of what I saw and heard. The parents chortled as their son talked about this brand new insect. They said he had an overactive imagination, and I gave a slight smile in agreement. But then the boy said something which chilled my flesh. "You've already forgotten, haven't you? That's what they do." His father scoffed. "They're just bugs, kiddo. I'm sure Dr. Farrow would be able to identify the species." The parents apologized for wasting my time and scooted their son away, but his words had dredged up that obscured memory of my visit to the pier. I remembered hearing a sound impossible to describe. I remembered seeing bugs of an impossible color dive into the water and disappear. Of course, as a scientist with beliefs still grounded in reality, I believed I might be having a psychotic break. The only way to be sure was to revisit the pier later that day. I went to the beach, stood at my safe distance of 100 yards, and watched the people walking the length of the elevated pier walkway. Below, there were no bugs, only a woman standing with her face craning upwards, so she could peek through the spaces between the pier boards overhead. She was flailing about erratically, steering stiff limbs, and popping goldfish-like lips, as if having a soundless conversation with someone. I followed her eyeline up to a lady on the pier. She was conversing with her friends and gesticulating enthusiastically with her arms. The woman below was imitating the woman above. I decided it was like watching a baby learn from an adult. Only this was a grown woman learning from another grown woman. "Is it a woman?" came a horrid thought as I eyed the mimicker below the pier, and that brought out an involuntary whimper of terror from the pit of me. It was only a quiet sound, too quiet for someone 100 yards away to hear. Yet, the imitating woman immediately froze in position, as if playing the children's game of musical statues. No more than a second later, she snapped her face my way. Her eyes were entirely white, only sclerae, with no pupils. It was an impossible white, like the shade I'd seen only once before, and when pieces of the woman's skin flaked off, carried by the wind towards me, I realized they were bugs. I realized she was bugs. I hightailed it to the beach car park, too winded to scream. However, when I turned to look behind me, there was nothing but a concerned passerby, likely wondering why I'd been in such a panicked hurry to get back to my vehicle. There were no white-winged insects. There was no woman. From that day, I made a concerted effort to avoid the coastal town and pretend none of it had ever happened. Forget the bugs, forget the boy. Return to ignorant bliss, contrary though that would be to my scientific principles. My fear overrode my curiosity. Forgetting worked to an extent. The mysterious sludge returned to my brain, drowning my memories. A defense mechanism of the bugs, I have always believed. Nevertheless, while driving through a nearby town a few weeks later, I saw her crossing the road, the woman from under the pier. As I stopped, so did she, and her head turned to show me her eyes, which were no longer white voids. They bore brown pupils atop the white. She looked human, and she moved like a human, and I was sure she would sound like a human too. But I saw the falsity of those eyes, and the smile below them, and when I really listened, I heard it again, that paper crumpling sound, worming its way through the crevices of my car's bodywork to drown the interior of the vehicle. The maddening hum of the white-winged water bugs seemed almost to carry, hidden among the static, a warning, seemed almost to carry words. "See you," I thought, for a moment, she would hurl her body onto the bonnet. My throat swelled and nearly closed up in terror as I waited for her to do so, and she certainly communicated that want with her eyes. Thankfully, she finished crossing the road, so I floored the accelerator pedal, believing I'd escaped her unscathed yet again. Then I looked into the rearview mirror and let out a terrified sob. Blood was trickling out of my ears. Her whispered, papery words had cut me. I managed to forget again, for the black memory sludge was a blessing as much as it was a horror. But there was no forgetting forever, I think. Like that little boy in the museum, I had opened Pandora's box. No matter how many times I buried the bugs and the woman, something would ladle out the sludge to dish up the truth once more. That sound of crinkling paper pursued me, and whenever I sought the source, I would always see somebody who didn't look quite right, off-white sclerae and strangely practiced movements. That was when I stopped hiding from it. I recorded audio of the strange crinkling sound in public, and I covertly snapped photographs of strange-eyed strangers. I pestered the other scientists about my findings, and it took only a week for the Institute to let me go, prompted by a supposed concern for your mental well-being. Some of my colleagues promised, apologetically, that they weren't being obstinate or oblivious. They were similarly unnerved by my data on this unclassified species of insect, but a higher up at the Institute had threatened them to leave it alone or be sent out the door alongside me. One colleague even mentioned he'd done a little digging and learnt of similar incidents at other scientific institutes. My advice: stop digging now. Dr. Farrow, count your blessings. I've heard of researchers meeting worse fates than a forced resignation. I felt vindicated. Of course, it wasn't only a little boy who knew about the bugs. Powerful people are covering this up. People who, I fear, might not even be people. You see, for the past 5 months, I've been burning through my savings on a quest for answers. I've been traveling from continent to continent, country to country, city to city, and town to town. I've been studying members of the public for hours each day, recording them, photographing them, and verging on harassing them. I'll admit, I've barely slept, barely ate, and after collating data from 36,794 people over the course of 189 days, do you know what I've found? 3,707 subjects had off-colored eyes, or, when I really listened, emitted that paper-crinkling hum, and they were always the people who regarded me with unyielding smiles, and the highest suspicion. Many would stop in their tracks and whisper terrifying threats with their paper-crinkling voices, slicing my ear canals and causing blood to trickle free. Once or twice, the more daring of them even charged at me, and I scarpered in fright. I found 3,704 human-presenting non-humans. 10%. 10% of people come from the sea as white-winged bugs, mimic our behaviors, then morph into us. 10% of people aren't people at all.
A bus driver told a story so scary it sent one boy into a coma, and the others passed out. A survivor shared the story with me. When I was 12 years old, a bus driver asked during a field trip if we wanted him to tell the scariest story ever. The story he told was so terrifying, it made everyone faint. No one would say what it was about later, just that it was the scariest thing that any of them had ever heard. Kids spoke of it in whispers, in rumors, but nobody would ever repeat it to me, no matter how I begged or pleaded. I was the only kid on the bus wearing headphones, so I didn't hear it. I had a brand new Walkman. Yes, I'm old. And when all the other kids were telling each other scary stories, I put my headphones on. I can't even remember where the field trip was going. Science museum? Anyway, it was a long drive for a dozen kids. What I do remember is seeing the bus driver, not our regular driver, but a substitute for the field trip, looking up at us in the rear view and asking if we wanted to hear the scariest story in the world. Everyone chorused, "Yes!" really loudly, and the driver kept insisting it was too scary for us. I think I rolled my eyes, and I remember him saying, "This story starts on a county road." Then I tuned him out and turned up the volume on my Walkman. And when the tape got to the end, I realized that the bus around me was silent. I looked up. Every kid sat slack-jawed and wide-eyed. I turned around in my seat to my best friend, Isaiah, sitting in the row behind me, and I asked, "Hey, what's going on?" His eyes flicked up to meet mine. He closed his jaw, but didn't say anything. "You okay? Why'd it get so quiet?" Somewhere on the bus, a whisper. A few kids up front talked in nervous undertones. I think they said, "Don't tell him," Isaiah said, his voice monotone. He told us a scary story. "What was it about?" I asked, turning my attention to the driver, who was also silent now, hands on the wheel, saying nothing, though he had a strange expression on his face. His eyes sort of glazed. "Can't tell you," said Isaiah. "Why not?" He didn't answer. Neither did anyone else. It was like whatever they'd heard had so terrified them that they were locked into trauma, just frozen there by this shared, collective, horrifying experience that I'd somehow missed. I don't know if you've ever ridden a bus full of school children, but it is never quiet. There is always chatter, but right then, other than the rumble of the engine, you could have heard a pin drop. "What was it about?" I repeated louder. At that moment, a horn sounded. Everyone clutched the seats as a truck barreled toward us. Later, I was told the bus drifted into opposing traffic. The truck driver's quick reflexes and veering saved us from a worse accident, but the impact still killed the bus driver, left one student in a coma, spun the bus, and knocked a bunch of us out. Later, the rumor would spread that the bus driver and students all fainted from the story, and that's what caused the crash. Anyway, I remember coming back to myself in my seat, sitting up, and seeing the blue sky outside, seeing the day look so normal, except for the steam, or smoke, from the bus and the truck. I heard sobbing from my classmates. Some of us were sent to the hospital. The rest of us were sent home. Days later, after everyone was back in classes, except the kid who fell in a coma, I asked a classmate, "Hey, Maria, you heard the story on the bus, right?" She was doodling on a notebook for our math class, but her pen stopped. She said softly, "Yeah, was it really scary?" She nodded. "The scariest story you ever heard?" She closed the notebook and moved to a different desk, saying loudly, "I don't want to talk to you, Joshua." Several other kids tittered. I think my cheeks went red. I wasn't a social reject. Not exactly, but I wasn't one of the popular kids, either. I tried with other kids who'd been on the field trip, but none of them would talk to me about it. Not even my best friend Isaiah. He just kept saying, "Nah, man, it's too scary." I snapped. Dude, just like summarize it if it's too scary. What was it even about? I'll tell you when I'm 55. 55? I don't want to have to think about it. Bro, just let it go. His refusal almost broke apart our friendship. But eventually, I accepted that nobody was going to tell me whatever had traumatized them so badly. It's a mystery I have agonized over for decades. Just last year, I found a note in my Google Calendar that I apparently made as a reminder to myself, telling me Isaiah's birthday, 55. I reached out, partly to wish him a happy birthday, but also to ask if we could catch up. We hadn't seen each other since our high school reunion, and we arranged to meet for coffee. When I arrived, I was surprised to see his glassy and yellowed eyes. He looked much older than 55. I tried to hide my shock, but he just smiled and said, "Pancreatic, cancer. I've got a few months, probably." "Oh," I said. "Oh, shit. I'm sorry. You look good, though." He raised his coffee cup to me. "Look like you're still 40 years old. How's life treating you?" I pulled up a chair and told him how I'd married and divorced. "Same," he said. "How I was an electrician and occasionally a freelance writer." He talked about recycling and community gardens, and about his 2 grandchildren, and how he'd founded a nonprofit because he wanted a better world for them. And as I began to reminisce about our school years, he raised a hand. "Before you ask, I'm not going to tell you that bus story." But he shook his head, told me that the students who heard all wished they hadn't, every single one. Trust me when I tell you, I say this with love, don't ask. If you hear it, you'll wish you hadn't. Brother, let it go. In spite of my disappointment, it was good to see him and catch up. It was also one of the saddest goodbyes I ever said, because I knew just by looking at him that it would be the last one. After that conversation, I finally accepted that the mystery would go unsolved. Until yesterday, it happened by pure accident. I finally heard it. The story the bus driver told. I was at a local bar, and I overheard from a nearby table a woman say, all telling scary stories, and the driver said, "Do you want me to tell the scariest story ever?" I immediately broke off from my own conversation and craned my neck to see who was speaking. It was a middle-aged woman, and I didn't recognize her at first in the low lighting. But as she kept talking, I realized, Maria. This was little Maria. Last I'd seen her, she'd been 12 years old. She'd gone to a different junior high and high school than Isaiah and I, but in her brown, curly hair, and the sideways quirk of her mouth when she talked, it was definitely her. Either she'd moved back to our hometown, or else, like me, had never left. Small world. The chatter was loud in the bar. I missed her next few words. "Are you serious?" gasped a girl at her table. "It's all true. Shinji fell into a coma. Devin's stepfather stabbed him. Mitsuko died at her wedding when the cake was smashed into her face, and one of the dowels went through her eye." More gasps. All of them happened like the driver said. Isaiah was 55 when the cancer got him, and he and I were the last 2. Oh, but the craziest thing, there was one other kid on the bus who wasn't listening. Her voice got lower, and I had to move closer, walking near her table. The driver saved him for last and said, "Joshua dies 3 days after he hears this story." And then the truck hit, just like the driver had told us it would right at the beginning. And poor Shinji fell into his coma. And that poor kid, Joshua never stopped asking. He asked all the time, what was the story? What was the story? We used to joke how if we never told him, maybe he'd never die. A strangled sound escaped my throat, and Maria looked up, and I hurried away, and I think she said my name. Isaiah, may he rest in peace, was right. He and the others protected me all these years. Damn it, brother, you were right. I wish I'd never heard.